Shining Force 3 was on the Sega Saturn. It came out in the late 90s. Scenario 3 was finished up, I think, sometime in 98. The first scenario came to America, sort of middling success, I think. The second and third one were only in Japan, and is only with like the recent not even recent, only with the continuing efforts of a group at Shining Force Central to translate it is it even possible to play if you speak English. If you can get through Saturn emulation, which is a little more complicated than usual, this is a truly pleasant game to play. I played Shining Force 1 and 2 innumerable times, and I didn't even really hear that Shining Force 3 existed until about 5 years ago or so. So I've been waiting for a little bit till the patch 25 came out for this, which had a lot of big QOL upgrades and ways to alter the gameplay to some degree. I played it all 3 games in a row, essentially. I played on harder, which is the 3rd difficulty to 4. I would not recommend the 4th difficulty setting unless you have like a pretty in-depth understanding of the game's mechanics, which for the period, the late 90s, which is around the same time of Final Fantasy Tactics, is quite ahead of its time and quite complex, honestly, in terms of the friendship system and the way that your weapon and its weapon proficiency levels and your weapon level affects how much damage your spells can do. I do not necessarily think these are the best systems ever. They don't necessarily lead to intuitive gameplay sometimes, and they're pretty obscured in how you would learn about this. I'm not sure how you would really know about these things unless you were tutored by an expert or were quite experienced yourself. But they are incredibly advanced systems, I think, for a tactics game in the late 90s. Generally speaking, the first game is largely political and the ruling and intricacies of nations and leaders. The second game kind of feels like a 1B to the first game's 1A, in that, largely speaking, the story, I think it's generally considered the weakest one. Most people think 3 is the best, followed by 1, followed by 2. 2, some of the reasons why I would say is 2, largely speaking, just basically is a commentary on and a reflection or a shadow of the first game's story, although it does lead in rather satisfactory moments into some of the major plot points of the third game, notably finding the godchild Gracia, who essentially in many ways is almost the protagonist of the third game. You have a save file that continues over from game to game, which becomes relevant at multiple different points, which is very, very cool for that period. The third game, I'm gonna talk about all 3 at once without necessarily trying to go sequentially go through it. It does really, really end with a bang, though, in a lot of extremely satisfactory ways. The game is, generally speaking, in the typical 32-bit fashion. The field screen is sprites on the 3D rendered background. The battle sequences are the type of completely polygonal battle sequences that don't tend to age too well, although generally speaking can be pretty impressive for the time. A lot of the character classes that you would recognize in Shining Force 1 and 2, you will see here. There's going to be your standard centaurs, healers, archers, hero, mages, rangers, which are basically centaurs with arrows, who are very, very weak in this with having lower range. And then you have a series of generally sort of unarmed beasts, monks, and you'll probably get a second of each of most of those characters over the course of the game. So, this is a logical extension of how top-down 2D strategy games from the largely Genesis era, like Shining Force 1 and 2, would expand to. You have some 3D elements you can rotate around the map. There's a lot of secrets there. There's a lot of battles, roughly 4 per chapter for 6 chapters for 3 games. I find that the general town traversal gets a little bit tiresome between battles. It takes a little bit too long. I did want to try to get as much dialogue as possible to see how the translation went and just kind of give the game a proper lip service for the first time I played it. There are some mechanical issues I have in terms of creatures that spawn and pop up over the course of battle, being able to act on that turn if the agility coincides properly with it. The final battle of the first game, I still think, is one of the grand, absolutely scandalous flaws of the entire game. You There's an optional super dungeon near the end of each of the games that also functions as allowing you to level up your characters. And that largely becomes necessary because at the end of game one and game two, you pretty much necessarily need to use your B squad of people that you haven't used in order to actually complete the game because it'll be a two squad setup, which is a nice idea in theory, but the game is sort of Darwinist to some degree in who you end up using. So to then have to go back and essentially grind to have two viable squads is like pretty deeply frustrating by the end. So there's some big picture, big swings here I think that ultimately miss. However, the same iteration of that in the third game is your full squads from all three games as your save carries over from each one, all basically have a contributing asset into the final battle. You basically have a three-pronged attack on the main headquarters, and then your primary group from your third game then continues to fight the last battle, which is extremely cool and extremely, extremely satisfying. Although, again, you do basically have to sort of grind up your previous squads in order to get them up to speed. Whatever. To kind of basically be like a final hurrah. I mind that less than the extremely sort of awkward and, to my mind, tiresome way that you do it in the first and second games. As I said previously, there's a lot of extremely intricate mechanics here. The more that your teammates interact with each other, heal each other, attack the same target, get kills, they get like a friendship buff where different people have different attributes that they boost of adjacent characters who they have friendship with. There's 4 levels of this. It can be anything from increased attack damage to increased magic damage to increased critical strike, defense, all these things. And these, if you are trying to play on one of the higher difficulty settings, or if you're someone who optimizes and min-maxes relentlessly, considering the fact that you lose these friendship levels upon death, and you're going to get deaths in this game, especially if you play in a harder difficulty setting, it encourages a sort of min-maxing and a very meticulous approach to the game, which I think does not necessarily make it more fun, although it does extremely squeeze out more performance on the high end of the game if you really want to work toward it. So ultimately, I don't really feel like I had a lot of time for this or really cared that much, although sometimes it would be a huge factor. I just didn't necessarily find that it was like very fun or very intuitive, especially with turn orders being somewhat randomized in order to find ways to use this as best you could. So ultimately, while I did get some benefits in this sometimes, it never really became more than an afterthought for me, similar to like the damage reduction of land effect of different parts on the map. Also, especially for casters, there are different sort of damage ratios for the spells that you have. Like this person will be better with fire, this person will be better with spark, this person will be better with freeze. This has to do with the characters, has to do with their weapons and their weapon levels. This is very, very hard to find information on anywhere in the game, and you basically have to be like tutored on this by someone who's very helpful in Twitch chat or something like that. So these are incredibly intricate mechanics for the game and things that have become totally things that are a factor in a ton of different games now. And so it's very, very impressive that these are included in a 1998 game. However, to learn how to use these as you play is basically just like iterative trial and error, and there's no way you would have really necessarily figured out much of these details. Generally speaking, in terms of how much damage your characters are going to do, I've almost never played a strategy game where I had less idea how much I was going to do at any one point. So there's something to that to some degree. The first and second game, especially the second game, I had probably the least amount of fun with. Sort of like the sophomore effort of here's this many battles in the game. There's roughly 6 chapters per game, 4 battles per chapter, roughly speaking. So to keep variety, I found especially in the second game, there was a lot of pop-ups, a lot of respawns, and a lot of sort of like gimmicky elements to each battle, which is becoming very, very tiresome. I do, however, want to sort of like double down a little bit on saying how terrific the third game is in many ways. The character models are improved as they've had more practice doing it. The story is more fun. The story is more fantastical, much more of a mythical element, a huge epic scale to it. Again, the final battle is essentially a 3-pronged attack of your full parties from all 3 games, helmed by 3 very, very similar main characters. I would also say that your choice of a team in the third game, they've done a lot better job of giving you really, really exciting choices. The first game is going to be like 2 Master Monks, 2 Ninjas, 2 Centaurs, 2 Archers, a lot of not much less unique classes, and a lot more of like a double up of here's a pre-promoted and here's an unpromoted character that you get much earlier. But by the third game, and especially near the end of it, like some of the final chapters of the third game, I really, really was, for the first time, basically, I felt like in the entire trilogy, extremely happy with the group I had. It was diverse. We had a good amount of front line, a lot of casters, which I tend to prefer in games like this. And it just, I found it so fun and so great. And it really, really it really, really was underlined to me, especially by the end of the third game, where in the latter half of it, you have a tier 3 level of promotions, which provides every single character from all 3 games a new tier of promotions, which is going to involve new character art, new profile pictures, and then there's like a top end paragon weapon for basically every single kind of weapon in the entire game. I think all of them with their own individual special attack. So it is totally incredible how much work they put into this game. The sheer scale of these games, it's kind of a shame in many ways. I'm not sure it would have ever been totally palatable and hugely popular with the North American audience. But the sheer amount of work of this game, the sheer amount of like ambition and scope of putting all these games together, all the stories together, is completely incredible. The amount of magic spells, the amount of different items, the amount of characters, all their different special attacks. There's so much work into this. There's so much stuff here that they put into it. I have to say it's incredibly good. The hardest battles in the game are basically like the heroes tests, which are optional dungeons to help level up your characters and give yourself ultimate rewards right before the final battle in every single game. Generally speaking, outside of the premium disc, which is a 9-battle gauntlet, you get the premium disc apparently by sending away proof to Sega or Camelot that you owned all 3 games, and they send it to you. It's a lot of art assets and videos and sound effects and showing all the 3D models, and then a 9-boss battle, including the hardest boss. Like basically the last 3 bosses are the bosses from the other Shining Force games. Shining Force CD, Shining Force 1, Shining Force 2, and I guess Shining Soul or something. I'm not sure what the Demon Dark Soul is from. And that's the hardest fight. That's the hardest fight in the entire game. Anyway, I have very few quibbles. I find the pop-up respawn mechanic and them getting turns almost immediately afterwards is immensely frustrating and terrible. The treasure temples, which are unique but 1 per chapter, areas where you fight little battle puzzles against thieves to get unique loot, those are often quite bad, I think, and very frustrating. You don't have a whole lot of room for error. They take a lot of time. The fact that some status effects like poison continue after battle into the next area can sometimes be often very, very frustrating. Some battles are absurd, like the Kraken battle, a lot of battles in Scenario 2, but those things are largely all good and not really going to stick with me. Some comments on the translation. The first game and a half or so is basically at a status where they say is completed. Most of the second game and then some parts of the third game are mostly done, and then there's like a playable status for the rest of it. It's hard for me to say necessarily how much of the game translation is due to it being a faithful English version of what the game is like, or how much that they just need to kind of get a little more flow into it. But I do find that most of all 3 games, but particularly the third game, which in many ways had the best story, has a very dry exposition-ish style. Characters don't really matter. Nearly no one has any personality at all. Really only Synthesis and Uriado are kind of like 2 fun stooges who argue with each other in the second game. It almost never matters who's really saying anything. There's a million characters of various generals and stuff like that who sometimes are playable but mostly aren't playable, who give you expository explanation. The entire third game, dialogue-wise, does feel very, very dry. In terms of everyone just explaining what's happening. Largely Bullzone monks are always telling you what's going on. So I would say story-wise there are ways this could be better, although in terms of the scope of what actually happens, it's really, really incredible. I really do enjoy that essentially the protagonist of the third game is the godchild Gracia, who's sort of like the messianic figure. They go from fairly useless from at the beginning of the game to extraordinarily powerful near the end. I do enjoy the premium disc allowing you to choose whomever you want from all 3 games parties. So you basically get like an all-star game to choose everyone you wanted. I obviously chose all 3 heroes to put in my party, and Gracia and Jane, which means that you have 4 different people at that point who will end the game if they die, which is a slight flaw to them being very, very strong. I'm not sure how much I more necessarily need to cover here. I had a lot of fun playing this. I'm glad to wrap it up. This is an extremely esoteric niche game. but those who love it a lot, and it's understandable why it deserves to be better considered along the lines of the same realm of Final Fantasy Tactics. Though I don't think it necessarily would be. Aesthetically, it's weaker. Very very complex storyline, probably more balanced in that game. I don't know. It's really incredible, and it's a shame that they couldn't do more of these things in this series. But ultimately, Scenario 3 stands out as I think one of like the great RPGs in scale and ambition of the late 90s 32-bit era. All right, ta ta.